So Shabbat Shalom, everybody. I can only imagine that there must be thousands of people watching online. At least that's my hope. Otherwise, the attendance is an indication of how little people actually care about Israel. That's not a comment about the people who are here, obviously, and gives me great pain. A colleague of mine, Rabbi Eli Garfinkel, in commenting on the opening verse of this morning's Parashat, wrote, "Standards of courtesy vary from culture to culture. In America, for instance, one eats with either the right or the left hand. In Arab and Indian cultures, by contrast, it's rude to eat with the left hand because it's thought to be dirty. The same concept applies to issues of frankness and privacy. In America, it's impolite to ask questions about another person's salary or benefits, as these are considered private matters. Likewise, Americans tend not to be completely open with their opinions. In Israel, however, it's acceptable to ask how much they earn, and opinionated frankness, known as durgi, is practically a national pastime." He goes on to say, "As I understand durgi, Israelis will confront each other with straightforward honesty as an expression of courtesy, albeit a kind of courtesy that foreigners frequently misunderstand. From the Israeli cultural point of view, a person worthy of respect deserves unvarnished truth, even if it causes discomfort. As a result, Americans will sometimes complain that Israelis are rude and brutally honest, while Israelis will say that Americans are fake and don't often say what they really mean." And that comes from a wonderful book that was published a few years ago by Rabbi Eli Garfinkel, entitled The JPS Jewish Heritage Torah Commentary. And I would encourage you to get that book and use it as a weekly compendium to your study. But today, I must speak frankly and openly, and even though I'm no Moses, I speak to the Jewish people. Of course, that's what I do every week, except, let's say, when there's a bar or bat mitzvah, and then there are non-Jews present. Because, as Garfinkel points out, a person worthy of respect deserves the unvarnished truth, even if it causes some discomfort. And we are most certainly a worthy group. Giddy Grinstein, a friend with whom I worked at UJA and who heads a think tank in Israel, remarked a few weeks ago that the American Jewish community has a role to play in the politics of Israel. Even though I have often, almost without exception, stayed away from making any statements about the internal workings of Israel's democracy because I don't live there and because honestly it's so hard to explain, yet he said, Giddy Grinstein wrote, "Standing up with confidence for the greatness of American Jewry can go hand in hand with supporting the state of Israel. But it also means no longer accepting the domineering Zionistic discourse that holds American Jewry to be second-class citizens of Judaism, and its subject, its interests to those of Israeli society. The mission of American Jewry," he writes, "should be to strive for being a robust, resilient, and prosperous diaspora that makes a most significant and distinct contribution to the security and well-being of the United States and to the Jewish people and Israel. Clearly, these goals are self-reinforcing. A robust and prosperous Jewish community manifested by the destiny and quality of its institutions can make a significant contribution which enhance the robustness of our community." What he's saying very simply is The American Jewish community is the greatest Jewish community in the history of the diaspora. We're not going anywhere. And we have a contribution to make to the landscape of history, of the history of our people. And that we must begin at home in America. And then we can add, almost simultaneously add to the well-being of the state of Israel. There's no question there is work for us to do here in America as Jews about and with our own Jewish community. But we do that not linearly, but we do so simultaneously. Parashat Vayikra, which begins the third book of the Torah, delineates the korbanot, animal sacrifices, singularly known as the korban, that the Israelites were commanded to offer to God. The word korban is based, as I suggested earlier, on the triliteral Hebrew root kuf resh bet, which means to come close, in a variety of different permutations. These offerings were understood to be the primary way to come close to God in a variety of circumstances, and we must draw closer not only to God, but to all our fellow Jews. As my mentor in Chicago, Rabbi Vernon Kurtz, used to say, B'chol makom shehem, in every place that Jews exist, we have to figure out how to draw ourselves closer to them, especially when we find them in danger. And our fellow Jews are in danger both from external forces who daily wreak terror on our people and from internal forces who seek to turn Israel's democracy into a theocracy and a dictatorship. Prime Minister Netanyahu is not king of the Jews, as an incredibly insightful article that was written by Gideon Levy, 8 years ago already. So, where are we? We used to speak of the threat to Israel as external only. It still exists, and in many ways there is a huge uptick in violence, especially surrounding events that have occurred in Yehuda v'Shomron, Judea and Samaria. We used to speak of the threat from Iran, which still exists and actually is becoming a bigger player in the Middle East as it allies itself with Russia and with Syria, two other countries that seek to destabilize world order. But the trading of arms for the conflict with Ukraine, for enriched uranium Iran needs to build a nuclear bomb, is just part of the external threat to the existence of the state of Israel and to the Jewish people, b'chol makom shehem, in every place that we find ourselves. We used to speak of the threat to democracy as the birth rate of the Arab population outpaced the birth rate of Jews in Israel. We used to worry about the fact that if you had an Arab faction that got to be so large, it could vote Jews out of the government. And in fact, we see that the Arab faction, the Joint List, was the third largest party in the Knesset in this last voting cycle. But never did I think that the threat to Israel's survival would be from a runaway government. Israel's undergoing a challenge to its version of checks and balances, just like here in the United States, in which we struggle regularly with the role of the Supreme Court and the executive branch who appoints members to that Supreme Court. We struggle, too, with our democracy. And I have so much more to say about that, but I removed this page from the sermon. Under the Netanyahu government, there is an attempt to give powers of the executive over the judicial. The challenge is that Netanyahu might be criminal in his actions. and therefore seek it for his own personal gain, not for the betterment of the world or its people. It's particularly troublesome because Netanyahu is under investigation, like a few other members of his cabinet, not unlike our government. As well, there are significant laws about personal status, best described as who is a Jew, that the current right-wing faction of the government would like to see changed. Vayikra el Moshe vayidaber Adonai elav me'ohel moed. God called to Moses and spoke to him from the tent of meeting, saying, "Speak to the Israelite people and say to them." And the Talmud on this pasuk says, Vayikra el Moshe vayidaber. God called to Moses and spoke to him, Lama hikdim kriya ledibur limda Torah derech eretz. Shelo yomer adam davar lechavero ela im kein karahu. The Gemara says something very simple. He says, why do we need the Torah to say Vayikra and then Vayidaber? That he called him and then spoke to him. And he says it's because the Torah is trying to teach a simple lesson. The Gemara is explaining a very simple lesson. You don't just jump in and start telling people what to do. First, you invite them in. The Torah is teaching, says the Gemara, derech eretz. You know what derech eretz means? Common courtesy and etiquette. The Torah Tamima explains that summoning people before speaking with them, we give the listeners a chance to focus on what we're saying. In doing so, we decrease the chances that we'll be misunderstood or ignored altogether. This rule of courtesy applies even to family and friends, he says. We might think that we can skip the rules of politeness with our inner circle, and become rude to our own family and friends. It suggests that we take their love and closeness seriously and not for granted. Professor Ari Ackerman, the president of the Schechter Institute of Jewish Studies in Jerusalem, shares a wonderful teaching on this issue as well. He says, the 4th chapter of Vayikra discusses the Korban Chatat, the sacrifice that you give after committing a sin, including atonement for a sin that you have committed inadvertently. The chapter enumerates 2 general cases when an individual sins and when the community sins. And then it enumerates 3 types of people who have sinned unintentionally: the high priest, the elders of the community, and the Nasi, the president. What's remarkable about this list is that it only contains those in government positions, either religious leaders such as the high priest or secular leaders such as the community elders or the Nasi. So why, asks Rabbi Ackerman, is it just the leaders? And then he quotes Yeshayahu Leibovitz, who teaches that the Torah is underscoring here a general proclivity of leaders who have authority in governments to sin inadvertently. The Torah recognizes here that it's human nature that power corrupts, and often in ways that are not evident even to the sinner. This is a realistic view regarding the sinfulness of those who wield authority. Maybe they don't mean to do it improperly. The very commandment again demonstrates the Torah's insight that we must take into account the likelihood of corruption and sinfulness in places of power and authority. The Torah in this instant plays the role of curtailing the unbridled power of a ruler. Thus, the Torah accepts the necessity and the importance of human rulers, but it requires the need to install a system of checks and balances against political authority, whether it's invested in a single individual or a group of politicians. So my message is pretty simple this morning. And again, I'm influenced by Giddey Grinstein's writings. And so I paraphrase. First, we must create an unprecedented opportunity to stand up for, serve, and offer leadership as one of the greatest diaspora in Jewish history, ensuring unwavering support for Israel from our government. In short, we must continue to love Israel, support it, stand by it, lobby for it here in this country to make sure it has all of the tools necessary for its own survival. We have extraordinary power here in America because we are one of the greatest Jewish communities in the history of our people in the diaspora. Second, we must reject a critical mass of ministers in the government of Israel who are not respectful to American Jewry, rejecting its legitimacy, and even doubting its longevity. We'll be here a long time. We're not going anywhere. We're under no threat to our existence. Third, we must work harder to bring substantive understanding to the Jewish community of America about the nuanced and specific changes being considered in Israel, such as repealing important reforms regarding pluralistic Judaism in Israel and legislation such as amending the law of return. What happens in Israel affects us here. And we have to understand what's going on in Israel. So let me speak so that we can speak intelligently about how those changes will affect us. And to do that, we must get into the muck of the technicalities and the complexities of Israeli societies. And I reiterate, it's hard to get into the weeds and really understand what's going on. There are any number of sources that you can consult on a regular basis to begin to grow your understanding of what happens in Israel and how the nuanced conversation is continuing. But we are smart, and we can do it. And this is the ideal time. We're not naive. We're not stupid. We can gain the understanding of the Israeli government and how it functions. We can understand the varied influences that come to the state of Israel. To which I add, we must find ways to share with the government of Israel and those who support them the pain and anguish they're causing us, not just Israeli society. And they are in pain. And the Israeli society is suffering. You can see it in the people crying in the protests. If you look closely at the Hebrew text, you'll see the first word. The aleph is written small. As I mentioned earlier this morning, I think the small aleph is there because it wasn't there initially and somebody squeezed it in later. Without the aleph, though, the word spells Vayikra, meaning and they are dear, special to us. Vayikra. Look, the Jewish people, b'chol makom shehem, everywhere where they are dear to us. Whether they are from Uganda or whether they are in Israel. Every time I have ever stood at the kotel, I have cried. I've cried for family and friends that I have lost. For family and friends who are suffering from life's threatening illnesses. I have cried when I stood at the kotel because I'm overwhelmed by the emotion that the state of Israel stirs within me. And now I cry for the precariousness of the democracy of Israel and losing the relationship I have with the greatest contributor to my sense of being Jewish that I have ever known, the Holy Land of Israel. And I stand today to say I will not let that happen. Shabbat Shalom. We continue with Musaf, page 184, Chatzi Kaddish, please rise.